Good afternoon. It's afternoon here in Scotland. Welcome everyone to this first live stream from the Violence Against Women Myths and Realities course. I'd like to say hello. I'm Annie Donaldson and my colleague
Roisin McGoldrick.
Welcome on the course, everyone. We've been delighted to read all your comments, and we're really thrilled that the range of people that are signed up, and you seem to come from all over the world, which is great, and it really adds to the debates and the discussions, and we've been really impressed by the richness of that and how eagerly and enthusiastically you've been engaging with all the questions, haven't we?
Absolutely. It's a very difficult subject, and that's evident in the thoughtful questions that people are posting in terms of thinking about your own lives and thinking about your own countries. And I think one of the really significant things about the course is the way that we build resources over the 6 weeks, when people realise that it's not just happening in Panama or in America or in New Zealand, but all over the world. And whilst on one hand that's really sad, on the other hand there's a sense of solidarity and a sense of commonality, and if we've got common problems, sometimes we can work towards common solutions for those problems.
Absolutely. And I was really struck by a lot of the questions as you begin to engage with some of the concepts that you covered in week 1 that you did with Roisin, some of the really basic ones, and then beginning this week, I think now we're getting deeper into the subject. You're beginning to ask some questions, and I think they're really valid and really rich questions. And I think I said I commented today actually that you'll get the answers to these as time goes on. And I think at the moment, it's a very pertinent question. Violence against women is all over the media, certainly in the UK and perhaps in your area. There's been a huge upsurge in the Me Too campaign in media, which we'll be covering in a couple of weeks. But also we had a very big case that was resolved in the courts in England yesterday with the sports coach who was convicted, and he was an abuser on an industrial scale, talking about the cases, and it was young boys and men. But a lot of the discussion is about it happening to boys and men, and I hope that you're beginning to see why we can still describe that as gender-based violence and violence against women in a sense, because it's gender-based.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We've got some questions that are beginning to come in now, and the first question that we've got from Melanie refers to the school shooting in America. A lot of discussion on toxic masculinity and its connection to violence against women. Possibly obsessed and stalking an ex-girlfriend that attended the school. Comedian Michael Black went viral with a tweet that said that the issue is because men and boys haven't been given the same opportunity as women to redefine themselves. Patriarchy affects everyone because it's the strict gender rules and codes, and women started the feminist movement to deconstruct the system, not just for us, but for men too. I wonder what your thoughts are in this conversation of toxic masculinity as violence against women, and that if men were more willing to embrace feminism, if that would help reduce violence against women and maybe in turn these mass shootings. It's an interesting juxtaposition, putting the mass shootings alongside violence against women and girls, because I'm not aware that any of these mass shootings have been carried out by a woman, so you might say there's a gendered element to them, but neither am I aware that any of the shootings have been targeted specifically at women and girls. It seems to have been fairly indiscriminate. The point that this question seems to raise, Melody, in relation to whether or not feminism or the adoption of feminism would help reduce such a thing, I suppose the straight answer to that is I'm not sure. That there is a massive issue in relation to the availability of guns in the US, and I suppose it takes some really careful and quite forensic analysis of these situations before we would just join them all together. Ideas of violence, I think, are certainly an area that we would want to look at through a gendered lens, but whether or not we can bring all of these things together, I'm not sure.
There are some debates. I think that your points about patriarchy are well made, and I think that nobody wins from patriarchy because it oppresses men and women together, and it creates a lot of typical gender roles which men and women tend to perform unless we begin to reflect on these things. And I don't know so much about the background of what they're calling the shooters, but I do know that some of the terrorism incidents where you've had mass killings, trucks being run into groups of people, etc., etc. There's been some research that shows an awful lot of them are actually the first victims of those individuals have been their partners and their wives. So there is a connection in relation to violence and the way that power is exercised in those arenas with people using guns, etc. And in relation to the American context, obviously there's a whole gun issue there, but the attacks and assaults on women and the homicides of women, there are more guns involved. But if someone is concerned to kill their partner or attack their partner, they'll use whatever weapons are available. And if guns are more available, the number of gun killings in relation to partners and ex-partners, for instance, is widespread in the States. So yes, I think Roisin's right. It's a very interconnected thing, but I think you can look at the use of violence and how that is coded into masculinity as something that may have an effect on that, and it may be something that we discuss later in relation to prevention later on. Any thoughts on the control of women by realisation to being nice? I think this reflects some discussion that was going on the course earlier this week about whether being nice has an effect on that. And I think I would echo what Roisin said in the stream discussion, that it doesn't really matter what you are, you don't deserve to be attacked or assaulted. And I think that the onus is on the perpetrator to stop doing what they're doing. And women can be nice, women can be not nice, but they don't deserve to be assaulted in any shape or form. So that would be the answer to that one, I would say.
It's really important not to attribute responsibility for violence to the victim rather than to the perpetrator. And I think that's where those kinds of comments, if women were nicer to their menfolk, they wouldn't be assaulted. Well, we'd have no evidence to demonstrate that. And in fact, we have a lot of evidence that says no matter whether someone performs every role, every task that they are asked to do so by their partner, that there's no evidence that prevents violence. So I think we just need to assign the responsibility for violence where it belongs, which is to perpetrators of violence and not to their victims.
And I think we'll be exploring that in more detail as the course goes on, is who's doing what to whom and why. And I think at the moment we're just building those blocks so that people can begin to explore them. So thanks for that question, Lillian. I think watch the space and hopefully we'll be able to answer that as time goes on. So there's a question here from Charlotte. Thank you, Charlotte. Looking to ask us if we can recall any incidents from research where women in the sex industry have felt empowered by what they do and the reasons they give for this. I'm not particularly a researcher in that field, but you perhaps will have seen Linda Thompson talking this week about her experiences of working women involved in prostitution in Scotland and the exhibition that she put on in relation to women's own art in relation to their experiences of working in prostitution. And I think the focus on that exhibition was on the harms and their experiences and their voices and what it was like to work there. And I don't think any of them, if I can recall, would suggest that it was empowering, which is not to say that some women might not find it empowering, and they may do. Mm-hmm. But the take on that we have is that we look for survivors' experiences and listen to what women say, and we'll be exploring that in more detail. But empowering or choice, these are two big concepts that come into many debates about prostitution. And I think that choice may well be exercised, but when you have a very limited range of choices, then is it a truly free choice? So again, we'll explore that in more detail, but it's a very, very topical debate. It's one that causes a lot of controversy, and of course it has a lot of legal implications because some countries legalise prostitution, whereas others take another approach to that. I don't know if you'd like to comment on any more of that.
So I suppose from an experiential point of view, women that I worked with as a social worker, women that I worked with who were involved in prostitution because they were poor, they had limited choices, they had been forced into prostitution, and certainly the experience of most prostitutes who are working street workers, for example, is that they are being forced to do this work. The proportion of women who choose to work in the sex industry vis-a-vis the proportion of women who find themselves in the sex industry by virtue of perhaps a drug and alcohol problem. And there's a big chicken and egg bit there. What comes first, the sex work or the addiction? But the women who actually choose that, I think, would be in the minority rather than the majority. And the vast majority of people who are involved in prostitution tend to be poor women who have very few other choices in their lives, or who have been forced into that by abusive partners.
Yeah, and I think also an awful lot of women, certainly the women that Linda works with and others, have found that a lot of women are brought into prostitution as children. And so once they're in that way of being and way of living, it's very, very difficult for them to exit. So I think the solutions to that would be to offer women other choices and see if they still choose to be involved in prostitution after that.
There's maybe quite an important distinction to be made there, because I think one of the issues that we saw in this country in relation to child sexual exploitation, for example, is that very young people who had been sexually exploited by adults were characterised as child prostitutes. I think that's an oxymoron. I think there's no such thing as a child prostitute. I think we have children who've been sexually exploited and who then see their life choices as limited, and who then are introduced into the world of prostitution. But for those children in the beginning, I think we have to remember first and foremost that they are children who've been exploited sexually by adults.
Yeah. So the second half of your question, Charlotte, was how is violence against women perpetrated by women different from violence against women? I suppose you mean perpetrated by men, perhaps? I would say that yes, women do perpetrate certainly gender-based violence, women in same-sex relationships, other women, but I think that, again, it's this business of a gendered hierarchy. But one thing I would say is that quite often, but in some situations, women do kill their partners, abusive partners. And some of the research shows that women don't use violence in the same way as men. And the experience of a woman abusing a partner, some of the research shows that the feelings of fear are not of the same nature as the feelings of fear that a woman would experience being on the receiving end. So there's a lot of really interesting research about that, which looks at the differences between, and again, the way that people perpetrate violence is gendered. The way women use violence, they tend to use weapons because they are physically often not as strong. So there are gender differences between the way men and women use violence as well. Any more questions?
I'm not sure that any of our questionnaires have identified which countries that they've come from. I can't see that in any of the questions, but it is quite telling, the range that we've seen over these 2 weeks. And this, you may or may not know that this is the second time that we've run this MOOC, and that's been one of the kind of real bonuses, I think, for us as educators, as well as the capacity to create a resource bank that has information, statistics, case examples from all over the world that and people are wrestling with these issues and trying to come up with I don't mean solutions, perhaps explanations, perhaps just kind of trying to interrogate what's happening in their own local environments in relation to the ways in which men and women live their lives, and whether or not these are radically different. And I think what many people are saying in the discussion boards is that these things are very subtle at times, and the big boys don't cry, and girls getting cuddles when they're hurting themselves, and these kinds of examples. I think many of the people who are joining in the discussion are reflecting on how these seemingly ordinary experiences contribute to a place where we are in the world where the behaviour, the gender-based violence has become almost an accepted thing. I suppose one of the things that the volume and the range of people who are contributing to the discussions on the boards now would say to us is that may have been the case, but we are hopeful and that people are engaging in this with a spirit of hope, with a spirit of let's seek alternatives, let's look at what the possibilities are. And I suppose we hope that as we go through the next 6 weeks, well, I suppose we've only got 4 weeks left, as we go through the next 4 weeks, people will learn and experience different ideas and different possibilities, and that's one of the kind of main purposes of the course.
And I think for me that one of the things that I've always been aware of, and both of us have been aware of teaching about this subject, is that when people come to it, some people, not everyone's coming to this new, but it always challenges, because violence against women has been invisible a lot of the time, and it's only in the last 30-40 years that the research and the campaigns have been so visible and so public across the world. So it's very challenging to be thinking about how you deal with children and how you treat and train your children to be boys and girls. And I think it very much asks you to consider and reflect on these fundamentals like we did in week 1. And I think you'll find it very challenging, perhaps, but also the course is called Myths and Realities. And I think that once we've got those basic questions being asked, then we're building blocks and creating some foundations where you can begin to understand it. And I love that people are researching different countries, their own countries, and they're finding that they're really, their eyes are opened as to things that they perhaps didn't know about before. So I think...
Okay. I don't see any more questions coming in. So I don't know if that's a timing issue of when we're doing this or whatever, or maybe people are still busy completing week 2, still doing all the exercises and still working away. We go in starting on Monday, we go into to week 3 and begin to hopefully take some of the conceptual ideas that have been around and let you see through examples, through some of the film materials, how these ideas can be applied in practice and in experience. So we hope that the huge numbers of you that are out there that are participating will stick with it.
Here's a question. Charlotte. Yes, Charlotte, yes, thank you for your kind comments. I'm glad you like the course. Oh no, it's KH Wilson Scott. Hello. And you've been working in a centre for 4 years, working with women, and no matter what the issue, you're using a community development approach. I think you'll find that as we begin to explore this, taking a survivor-led approach is very much the way to do this. And a lot of the interventions that we'll be talking about are very much grounded in survivors' experience, and most certainly taking a community development approach.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you think this approach is more or less effective compared to the specific services such as rape crisis and women's aid? I guess I think there's a place for both.
Both, I would say so, for sure.
I think challenges to attitudes, challenges within communities to attitudes can be powerful ways of changing those things. But I do think there is a need. The services that organisations like Rape Crisis and Women's Aid provide are absolutely necessary. You know, that people need to have a safe place. Victims of sexual violence, victims of domestic violence need to have a safe space in which to talk initially, and the community development model that would take us out from individual experience into sharing experience and common experience, and the potential for people to come together around significant issues, I think holds tremendous promise for this kind of work. And I guess the endorsement of a community, of a way of life, is a significant factor in allowing that way of life to continue. The condemnation of a community about a way of life is similarly. So I think a community development model certainly has a place, but I don't think it's an either or.
No,
I think it's a
agree.
both. I think we need a diverse range of places and spaces in which to challenge gender-based violence.
And just to add to that, community development approaches can be really helpful. I've seen examples of it where it's been very useful working with survivors who have begun on their recovery, and they're looking for other activities, and they've been brought together in women's centres and other community development activities, and community development services and departments can have a really good role in helping women to reconnect to their community, to develop, build skills and all that kind of thing. So yes, I would agree with Roisin. I think it's definitely, they're both compatible, and I think you do need both in someone's recovery journey.
Christiane's asked for an explanation of the different approaches that we just mentioned. We'd probably need more than a couple of minutes to describe some of those approaches, but a community development model would be looking at the experiences and the resources and the strengths and the skills of people within a community and how those can be linked together. But communities don't always have to be geographical. Sometimes we can have virtual communities and communities of practice where people who are experts in their own experiences can reach out and help others to either understand their own experience better or simply to feel less alone. We know that one of the features of gender-based violence is that it's isolating, and so people can sometimes feel that they are alone with this difficulty, they are alone with this shame, they are alone with this. So a community development model would certainly help us to reduce those feelings of isolation, but people have to be ready for that, and I think that's why I would say there's always a place for the individual one-to-one counselling. But some of the materials that you will see as you go through the MOOC of women coming together to support one another and to the strength that they've gained from the realisation that they weren't alone, I think is one of the factors that would make me say that a community development model has a huge amount to offer in relation to addressing this
issue. And
of
course, Rape Crisis and Women's Aid, they started out as community activists. They were all activist movements who felt there was a gap and there was something needing to be done and changed in their communities. So these were women who got together way back in the 1970s and 80s to actually work. So they built their own community development approach, and it also links to community learning where people might feel they want to learn. So absolutely, I think that these are very much rooted in, and they're not about people going into a community and telling them what they need, very much about people taking power in themselves and actually building up a portfolio of things or telling the authorities what they need. And in the case of the Women's Aid movement, it was that they needed more services. So I hope that answers your question.
Your question makes me think, Christiane, about what we've seen in terms of the reduction of community-based models of practice in the UK, well, perhaps particularly in Scotland. When I was a practising social worker before I came to work in social work education, we had a community work team who worked alongside the social work team, and oftentimes their role was about generating activity around issues that affected particular communities. We've seen a vast reduction in those kinds of teams and those kinds of workers in the last 20 or so years in Scotland. And I suppose, when we think about bigger narratives in relation to this, we think about how individualised our societies become, and when we think about when an awful thing happens, one of the reactions is to look for an individual to blame rather than looking at systemic issues for some of the problems that we experience in society. And as our country in Scotland has become a more stratified country in terms of people in different stratas of society having different expectations about the way they live their lives, things about neighbourhood, community, neighbourliness, the shared lives, that parts of our lives that might formerly have been lived in public have been moved into the private. And so there are major discussions and arguments around what impact that then has, you know, and constantly you're balancing the right to privacy and the right to family life against not making everybody subject to the surveillance of the state. But if we have so much concern for privacy and the right to private family life, then what we also do perhaps is to cut people off from sources of support, and people then perhaps do operate in much more contained and isolated environments than they may have done at other points in history.
So you've started us off now. I was just thinking about the ecological model and how the community can also be a source of norms and values, and it may be that the local community is quite traditional in the way that it approaches the way men and women should behave and what the norms are there. So you might be challenged to offer an alternative in that environment where communities are very, very traditional. So the community development approach might have a longer way to go in that environment if it's tackling violence against women. Oh, K.H. Wilson Scott completely agrees. Good. That's great.
I suppose that's, I mean, it is important for us to recognise that there will be different approaches will work for different people. Do you know, we can't force people into a community development approach of group and sharing if they are making that journey from fear and from you know, a sense of isolation. You know, to catapult somebody into group or community without that person being ready for that probably would be quite a harmful thing to do rather than a supportive and helpful thing to do. So it's about respecting individual needs and looking at tailoring help according to a person's needs.
I was just thinking as you were talking that we've got a wee community developing here, and we're very aware that there's a lot of different views coming in, and what I've been really impressed by is that people have been very respectful, and we've asked people to consider what they say, and I think we're developing a wee community here, and I think with this issue you've got to not get really angry with it, and you can be, people could be quite polarised, and it's really important to listen and to recognise that your view is not everybody's view, and not to take things too personally, but to open up the debate. And I think that's been one of the problems with this issue, that the debate has been completely closed down because it's polarised and people think it's simple, which is not at all. Okay, so
Melody, you've come back with another question here about how do we stop people blaming women for abuse and rape issues. What was she wearing is always brought up. I think that goes back to what I was saying right at the very beginning. We have to stop focusing on victim behaviour and victim attire and look at perpetrator behaviour. And, you know, for anyone ever to say that somebody deserves to be raped or abused because of what they were wearing, it just seems to me such an obscene way to consider what might be a motivation for something. So I hope that becomes less and less of an argument that we blame people for an assault upon them, which is perpetrated by someone whom they have absolutely no control over, because someone doesn't like the way that they've dressed, or perhaps likes the way that they've dressed too much or in an inappropriate manner.
Okay, so I think what we're trying to do is shift the balance. There's a default at the moment that I think society historically has had to blame the victim and to blame the person who's on the receiving end of a violence and abuse. So I think what we're trying to do is encourage you to recognise that there isn't an equality in that, and that we need to be thinking about focusing it differently. And it's something called the balance fallacy, and there ain't no balance. So maybe that's a useful point to wind up, unless you've got anything else to say, Roisin, because I think, well, thank you for all your questions, and we'll look forward to continuing the discussion over the next couple of weeks, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye.